From now on, you sleep in the garage, my husband said, his voice cutting clean through the clatter of silverware as if it had been rehearsed, as if this moment had been waiting for me all along. I remember the way the room fell still, how even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to pause, like the house itself was holding its breath. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and I have spent 42 of those years sitting at that same oak dining table, serving meals, listening to stories, building a life that I believed was mine. That night, I simply looked up at Richard, at the man who once held my hand during long drives through the Midwest, the man who used to call me his anchor, and I said, "Okay." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why. I didn't look at our son, Daniel, or his wife, Claire, who sat across from me pretending to be very interested in their plates. I stood up slowly, as if my body already understood something my mind had not yet caught up to, and I carried my dish to the sink, rinsing it under warm water that felt strangely distant against my hands. No one stopped me. No one said a word. The chair I left behind stayed empty, pushed slightly back, like a quiet reminder that something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and old cardboard, a place meant for things that didn't belong inside the house, things that had been set aside, forgotten, or deemed unnecessary. I turned on the single overhead bulb, its pale light flickering once before settling, and for a moment I just stood there, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter drifting from the kitchen, soft and distant, as if they came from another life entirely. I found an old folding chair tucked against the wall and sat down, smoothing my hands over my knees the way I used to when I needed to steady myself before a difficult conversation. But there was no conversation coming. Not tonight. Instead, I looked around at the boxes stacked neatly in the corner, at the shelves lined with things Richard once insisted we keep, just in case, and I realized something that felt both small and enormous at the same time. Nothing in. This space had been placed here by accident. Not the boxes, not the chair, and certainly not me. Earlier that week, I had noticed the way Richard avoided my eyes when I spoke, the way he lingered just a second too long over his phone, his thumb scrolling through something he never shared. I had noticed Claire whispering to him in the hallway, their voices dropping the moment I entered the room. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things, that after so many years together, it was easy to mistake distance for deception. But sitting there in the garage, with the cold concrete floor beneath my feet and the quiet pressing in around me, those small moments began to line up in my mind, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. I let out a slow breath and leaned back in the chair, my eyes settling on a familiar box tucked behind a stack of old paint cans. It was labeled in Richard's handwriting, neat and precise, the way he used to label everything when he wanted to make sure it wouldn't be overlooked. I hadn't seen that box in years. Not since we moved things around after the last renovation. I stood up, walked over, and brushed a thin layer of dust from the top, my fingers tracing the edges of the tape. For a moment, I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I suddenly understood that whatever was inside would not be there by chance. Richard was not a careless man. He planned. He prepared. He made sure everything was exactly where he wanted it to be. And tonight, he had sent me here. I peeled back the tape slowly, the sound sharp in the quiet, and lifted the lid just enough to see the corner of a folder inside. Thick, official, and very much out of place among the old receipts and warranty papers. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I closed the box again, pressing the lid down firmly, and allowed myself the smallest, quietest smile. Because for the first time that evening, something made sense. He thought the garage was the end of the story. But sitting there, under that flickering light, I realized it might be exactly where mine began. I did not sleep that night. Not even for a minute. But it was not the cold that kept me awake, and it was not the thin blanket I had pulled from an old storage bin. It was the quiet clarity settling into my mind like something that had been waiting patiently for years. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not confused about what was happening inside my own home. The house above me went still around midnight, the footsteps fading, the last cabinet closing, the television turning off, and in that silence I could finally hear my own thoughts without interruption. I sat there on that folding chair, the same one I had used during garage sales decades ago, and I began to replay the last few months, not with emotion, but with precision. Richard had changed long before that dinner. I could see it now in the smallest details. The way he started taking calls outside, stepping onto the back porch even in the cold. The way he began locking his study door, something he had never done in 40 years. The way he stopped asking me about bills, about taxes, about the things we had always handled together. At first I told myself it was age, that maybe he wanted control, that maybe he needed to feel useful again. But sitting there, I understood it was not about control, it was about separation. He was slowly removing me from the structure of our life, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left for me to stand on. I stood up again and walked back to the box, lifting the lid this time without hesitation, pulling out the folder and placing it on the small workbench beneath the window. The glass was dusty, but enough streetlight came through to let me see the edges of the documents clearly. They were not old. The paper was crisp, the ink sharp, recent. I opened the folder carefully, and the first thing I saw was my name, Margaret Collins, printed in bold letters, followed by language that was far too formal to be anything casual. Legal language. Structured. Intentional. I did not rush. I read slowly, line by line, the way I used to read letters from the bank when we were younger and every dollar mattered. Property adjustments. Ownership restructuring. Signatures required. My eyes moved down the page until they reached the section that made everything settle into place. There were spaces for 2 signatures. Richard had already signed his. Mine was blank. I let out a quiet breath, not sharp, not shocked, just steady, because now I understood the timeline. This was not about anger at dinner. This was not about a moment of cruelty. This was preparation. He needed me out of the house, out of the bedroom, out of sight, long enough to position everything exactly where he wanted it. And I had just given him that without resistance. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of it, not physically, but in what it represented. Upstairs, in the house I had helped build, they were sleeping comfortably, believing that I had accepted my place, that I would follow the path they had quietly designed for me. I thought about Daniel, about the way he had not looked at me during dinner, about Claire's silence, her careful stillness, and I realized something else just as important. This was not one person's plan. It never is. These things grow in silence, in conversations behind closed doors, in agreements that are never spoken out loud in front of the one person they affect the most. I walked over to the small sink in the corner and turned the handle slightly, letting the water run just enough to fill the quiet. Then I looked at my reflection in the dusty mirror hanging above it. I looked older than I felt, but my eyes were clear, steady in a way they had not been in years. I was not the woman they thought I was. Not anymore. I turned the water off, wiped my hands on a cloth, and carried the folder back to the chair, placing it carefully beside me. I did not need to confront anyone. Not yet. Confrontation is loud, messy, and often rushed. This required something else. Something quieter. Something patient. I leaned back again, folding my hands in my lap, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to think not about what I had lost, but about what they believed they had already taken from me. And that difference, that small shift in perspective, changed everything. By the time the first light slipped through the narrow garage window, I had already made my decision, not in a dramatic way, not with anger or tears, but with a quiet certainty that settled deep in my chest, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real. I folded the documents back into the folder with careful precision and placed it exactly where I had found it, aligning the edges so that nothing looked disturbed. Because if there was one thing I understood about Richard, it was that he noticed details, especially when those details confirmed that everything was going according to his plan. I stepped back and looked at the box for a moment, memorizing its position among the others, the slight tilt against the paint cans, the layer of dust that I made sure to smooth back into place with the palm of my hand, leaving no trace of interference. Then I turned off the light and stood in the dim early morning, listening again, this time not for what had been taken from me, but for what was still within my reach. When I walked back into the house through the side door, the kitchen was quiet, the same kitchen I had stood in thousands of times before, but it felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. I moved slowly, deliberately, pouring myself a cup of coffee the way I always did, measuring the grounds, filling the machine, waiting for the familiar sound to fill the space. Routine can be a powerful disguise. By the time Richard came downstairs, I was already seated at the table, my cup in front of me, the morning light soft against the walls, as if nothing had happened the night before. He paused when he saw me, just for a second, and in that pause I saw something flicker across his face, not concern, not regret, but calculation, as if he was adjusting his expectations in real time. "You are up early," he said, his voice neutral, controlled. I looked at him and gave the smallest nod. "I have always been an early riser," I replied, my tone even, calm, leaving no room for questions. He studied me for a moment longer, then moved past me to the counter, pouring his own coffee, his back turned, his shoulders slightly tense. He did not ask where I had slept. He did not mention the garage. That told me everything I needed to know. Silence, in this house, was never accidental. It was agreement. It was confirmation. It was strategy. A few minutes later, Daniel walked in, his steps slower, hesitant, as if he was unsure of what he would find. His eyes met mine briefly before dropping to the floor, and I saw the same thing I had seen the night before. Not guilt, not exactly, but avoidance, the kind that comes from knowing something is wrong and choosing not to interfere. "Morning, Mom," he said quietly. I smiled at him, a soft, ordinary smile, the kind that belonged to a different version of me. "Good morning, Daniel," I said, as if this was just another day, as if I had not spent the night sitting on a folding chair in the garage, reading documents that would have erased me from my own life. Claire joined us a moment later, her expression carefully composed, her movements precise as she reached for a glass, filling it with water, her eyes flicking toward Richard before settling on the counter. She did not look at me at all. That, too, was deliberate. I took a sip of my coffee and let the silence stretch, not uncomfortable, not tense, just present, like a quiet understanding that none of them were ready to acknowledge. Inside, I was already several steps ahead. I knew now that this was not about a single document or a single moment. This was a process, one that had likely been unfolding for months, maybe longer, and if they believed I would react quickly, emotionally, they would be prepared for it. But patience changes the balance of power. It shifts the ground beneath the people who think they are in control. I finished my coffee and stood up, carrying my cup to the sink, rinsing it slowly, listening to the sound of water against porcelain. "I will be out for a while this morning," I said, my voice calm, almost casual. Richard glanced over his shoulder, his expression tightening just slightly. "Where are you going?" he asked. It was the first real question he had asked me since the night before. I dried my hands and turned to face him, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he had spoken those words at dinner. "I have a few things to take care of," I said simply. I did not elaborate. I did not explain. And in that moment, I saw it again, that small shift, that flicker of uncertainty he had not expected. Because for the first time, I was not following the script he had written for me. I walked past them without another word, picking up my coat from the chair by the door, the same coat I had worn through winters when money was tight and life was uncertain, and I stepped outside into the cool morning air. The world beyond that house felt steady, unchanged, and as I closed the door behind me, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed they had already moved me out of my place in this family. What they did not realize was that I had just stepped into a position they could not see. I drove without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car sharper than any music could have been. And for a few miles I simply let the road stretch ahead of me while the morning traffic moved in its usual steady rhythm, people heading to work, to errands, to ordinary lives that had not shifted overnight the way mine had. There is something about early morning light that makes everything look honest, no shadows deep enough to hide anything, no distractions, just clear lines and quiet truth. And as I gripped the steering wheel, I found myself thinking back, not to last night, not to the garage, but to years ago, to a version of this same road when Richard and I were younger and everything ahead of us felt like something we were building together. I remembered the first house we bought, small, barely 1,200 square feet, with creaky floors and a kitchen that needed more work than we could afford at the time, and how we spent weekends fixing it piece by piece, painting walls, replacing cabinets, learning as we went because we had no choice but to make it work. I remembered the nights we sat at a card table because we had not yet bought a proper dining set, eating simple meals and talking about the future as if it was something we could shape with our hands. Back then, Richard used to look at me when I spoke, really look, as if what I said mattered in a way that went beyond the moment. He used to ask my opinion before making decisions, even small ones, and when Daniel was born, he held him like something fragile and important, promising me in a quiet voice that we would always take care of each other, that no matter what happened, we would face it together. That word, together, had meant something to me for a long time. It had guided the way I lived, the way I gave, the way I stayed, even when things became difficult, because I believed that commitment was not something you set aside when it became inconvenient. But somewhere along the years, that understanding had shifted, not suddenly, not in a way that could be pointed to and named, but gradually, like a line moving just enough each day that by the time you noticed it, everything had already changed. I pulled into the parking lot of a small office building on the edge of town, the kind of place you might pass without ever thinking twice. Brick exterior, simple signage, nothing that called attention to itself, and I turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the wheel. This was not a place I visited often, but it was not unfamiliar either. Years ago, when we finalized paperwork for the house, when we set up accounts, when we made plans that were meant to protect both of us, this was where we came. Back then, we walked in side by side. Today, I stepped out of the car alone, closing the door with a quiet click, and as I made my way toward the entrance, I felt none of the hesitation I might have expected. Inside, the air was cool, steady, the faint scent of paper and polished wood lingering in the hallway, and I approached the front desk where a young woman looked up with a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" I returned the smile, just as polite, just as calm. "I would like to speak with Daniel Brooks," I said, my voice even measured. "Tell him Margaret Collins is here." She nodded and reached for the phone, and as she made the call, I stood there quietly, my posture relaxed, my expression composed, giving nothing away. Because this was not about urgency. It was about timing. It was about stepping into a conversation that should have happened long ago, on my terms, not his, and as I waited, I understood something with complete certainty. The life I had built had not disappeared overnight. It had been moved, shifted, redefined without my consent. And now, for the first time in years, I was about to decide what it would look like next. Daniel Brooks had not changed much over the years, and I noticed that the moment he stepped into the reception area, his posture still carried that same quiet confidence I remembered, the kind that does not rely on being loud to be effective. And when his eyes found mine, there was a brief flicker of recognition followed by something more attentive, more focused, as if he understood without being told that this was not a casual visit. "Margaret," he said, extending his hand, his tone warm but measured. "It has been a long time." I took his hand and nodded slightly. "It has," I replied, keeping my voice steady, calm, as if I had all the time in the world. He gestured toward his office, and I followed him down the hallway, my steps even, my pace unhurried, taking in the familiar surroundings without letting it show that I was placing every detail into context. When we entered his office, he closed the door behind us and motioned for me to sit. I did, smoothing my coat lightly as I settled into the chair, my hands resting in my lap, composed, deliberate. He took his seat across from me, leaning forward just enough to signal that he was paying attention. "What can I do for you?" he asked. There was no small talk, no unnecessary delay. That was one of the reasons we had trusted him all those years ago. I looked at him for a moment before speaking, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted to say it exactly once, clearly and without hesitation. "I need to understand what has been done without my knowledge," I said, my tone even, precise. His expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if he had been expecting something like this, though perhaps not from me. "Tell me what you have seen," he said. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small notepad I had taken from the kitchen earlier that morning, not the original documents, never the originals, but notes, carefully written, details remembered, phrases that mattered. I placed it on the desk and turned it toward him. "Property adjustments," I said quietly. "Ownership restructuring. My name is still there, but only until it is not." He read the page without interrupting, his eyes moving steadily across the lines, and when he looked up, there was no confusion in his expression, only confirmation. "Do you have the documents?" he asked. I shook my head slightly. "Not with me," I said. but I have seen enough to know they are recent, and I have not signed anything." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together, and for a moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the building's air system. "Then nothing has changed," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Without your signature, those documents mean nothing. They are preparation, not execution." I let that settle, not reacting outwardly, but feeling the weight of it shift inside me, just slightly, just enough to confirm what I had already begun to understand. "And if I were to sign?" I asked, not because I intended to, but because I needed to hear the answer. His gaze held mine steadily. "Then you would be giving up your legal position voluntarily," he said. "Everything would move exactly the way it is written." I nodded once, absorbing the clarity of it, the simplicity behind something that had been presented as complex and inevitable. "I see," I said quietly. He studied me for a moment, then leaned forward again. "Margaret, if someone is trying to move you out of your own property without your consent, that is not just a misunderstanding. That is a strategy, and strategies can be countered." I allowed myself the faintest hint of a smile, not warm, not cold, just present. "That is exactly why I am here," I replied. "I am not interested in reacting. I am interested in understanding how to proceed." He nodded, a slight shift in his posture indicating that the conversation had moved into familiar territory for him, structured, deliberate. "Then we begin by protecting what is already yours," he said. "And we do it quietly." I folded my hands again in my lap, my shoulders relaxed, my breathing steady, because for the first time since the night before, I was no longer standing on uncertain ground. "Quiet works for me," I said. And as he reached for a folder from his desk, opening it with practiced ease, I understood something that Richard had not accounted for. He believed he was the only one making plans. He was not. I did not stay long after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be set in motion had already begun, and I understood that the most effective actions are often the ones that unfold quietly, without announcement, without urgency that others can detect. Daniel walked me to the door, his tone steady as he outlined the next steps, simple things on the surface, but each one placed carefully, like pieces on a board that only reveal their purpose when seen together. "Do not confront anyone," he said, pausing just before I stepped out. "Do not sign anything, and do not let them know you have been here." I met his gaze and nodded once. "That will not be a problem," I replied, because the version of me they expected, the one who would react, who would question, who would try to fix things through conversation, that version no longer served any purpose. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, the sun higher now, casting clear light across the parking lot. And as I walked back to my car, I felt a calmness that was not forced, not something I had to hold on to, but something that had settled into place on its own. The drive back was different from the one that brought me here. I noticed small things, the way the trees lined the street, the rhythm of traffic lights, the quiet steadiness of a world that continued without interruption, and it reminded me that whatever was happening inside that house was contained, limited, not as absolute as it had felt the night before. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked the same as it always had, the same front porch, the same windows, the same neatly trimmed lawn that I had spent years maintaining, but I no longer saw it as a place that defined me. I saw it as something I understood. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with the same quiet care I always had, and immediately I could sense the difference in the air, not dramatic, not obvious, but present. Voices from the kitchen, low, measured, stopping for just a second when they heard the door. I hung my coat on the same hook, aligned it with the others, and walked in as if nothing had changed. Richard stood by the counter, Daniel seated at the table, Claire near the sink, each of them positioned in a way that felt almost rehearsed, as if they had been waiting, not for me exactly, but for confirmation of something they had already decided. "You are back," Richard said, his tone neutral, but there was a slight tension beneath it, something he was trying to keep contained. I nodded, setting my keys down in their usual place. "I had a few things to take care of," I said, repeating the same words from earlier, unchanged, consistent, offering nothing more. Claire glanced at Richard, a quick, subtle movement, then back to the counter, her hands busy with nothing in particular. Daniel looked at me for a moment longer this time, as if searching for something, a sign, a shift, anything that might confirm what they believed had already happened. I gave him nothing. I moved through the kitchen with quiet familiarity, opening the cabinet, taking out a glass, filling it with water, each action deliberate, unhurried, the same way I had done it for years. Routine, again, can be a powerful form of control. "We should talk later," Richard said, not as a question, not quite as a command, but something in between, something that assumed agreement. I turned slightly, meeting his eyes with calm steadiness. "If there is something you would like to discuss, we can do that," I replied, my voice even, leaving the timing undefined, leaving the structure open, shifting the weight of the conversation back toward him. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but I saw it register, that same flicker of adjustment, the realization that I was not moving exactly as expected. I took a sip of water and set the glass down, then turned toward the hallway, my steps measured as I walked past them, not avoiding, not confronting, simply existing in the space without giving them access to what I now knew. Behind me, the silence returned, heavier this time, filled with unspoken questions, with calculations that no longer aligned as neatly as they had before. And as I reached the doorway, I understood something that made everything else easier. They were waiting for me to react. And as long as I did not, they had no way of knowing how far ahead I already was. The rest of that day unfolded in a way that would have seemed ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. And that was exactly the point, because nothing disrupts a plan faster than the absence of the reaction it depends on. And I could feel that absence settling into the house like a quiet pressure that none of them quite knew how to handle. I went about my routine with the same precision I had always carried, opening drawers, folding laundry, wiping down counters that did not need to be wiped, each movement steady, deliberate, as if nothing inside me had shifted, but beneath that calm surface, every detail mattered now in a way it never had before. I noticed which doors were left slightly ajar, which conversations stopped when I entered a room, the way Claire's voice lowered when she spoke to Richard, and the way Daniel lingered longer than necessary, as if he was waiting for me to say something that would confirm whatever version of the story they had already agreed upon. But I gave them nothing. Silence, I had learned, is not emptiness. It is space. And in that space, people reveal more than they intend. Late in the afternoon, I made my way back toward the garage, not hurried, not secretive, just as someone might when looking for something they had stored away long ago. The door creaked slightly as I opened it, the familiar scent of oil and dust greeting me again, and I stepped inside, closing it gently behind me. The box was still there, exactly as I had left it, untouched, undisturbed, and that told me something important. No one had come looking. No one had checked. They believed I had accepted my place without question, that I had retreated fully into the role they had assigned me. I walked over and stood in front of it for a moment, my hands resting lightly at my sides, not reaching, not rushing, just observing. Then I turned away. I did not need to open it again. Not yet. Information, like action, has its timing, and I was no longer acting on impulse. Instead, I reached for a different shelf, one filled with old files and boxes that had been moved here during the last renovation, things Richard had once said were not important enough to keep inside, which now struck me as an interesting choice of words. I pulled one down carefully and opened it, flipping through documents that spanned years, tax returns, insurance policies, receipts from repairs we had both paid for, and as I read, I began to see the structure of our life not as it had been presented, but as it actually existed, layered, interconnected, far more balanced than anyone had recently suggested. My name was everywhere, not as an afterthought, not as something temporary, but as an equal, a partner in decisions that had built everything we now lived in. I closed the file and placed it back exactly where it had been, aligning it with the others, my movements precise, controlled. Upstairs, I could hear faint footsteps, the soft rhythm of someone moving through the hallway, unaware of what I was doing just below them, and that distance, that separation between what they believed and what was real, felt like an advantage I had not realized I possessed until now. When I returned to the house, the light had begun to shift toward evening, casting long shadows across the floors, and I moved through the rooms without hesitation, setting the table for dinner the same way I always had, placing each item with care, not because I needed to, but because consistency is its own kind of message. When Richard entered the room, He paused again, just briefly, taking in the scene, the table set, the quiet order of everything, and I could see the question forming, the uncertainty he was trying to measure without asking directly. "You do not have to do that," he said, his tone almost casual, but not quite. I looked up at him, my expression calm, steady. "It has always been done this way," I replied simply, my voice carrying. No challenge, no resistance, just fact. He nodded, but it was not agreement. It was adjustment. Across the room, Claire watched without speaking, her eyes moving between us, calculating, while Daniel remained still, his silence heavier now, as if he was beginning to understand that something was unfolding beyond his view. And as I placed the last plate on the table and stepped back, I realized something with quiet certainty. They were waiting for a moment that was never going to come. Because I was not preparing to defend my place in that house. I was preparing to redefine it entirely. Dinner that evening moved with a strange kind of precision, not the easy rhythm we once had, but something tighter, more controlled, as if everyone at the table was aware that something had shifted, but no one was willing to be the first to name it. And I could feel that tension settle into the space between us with every small movement, every glance that lingered just a second too long before being pulled away. I served the food without comment, placing each dish exactly where it belonged, my hands steady, my posture relaxed. And when I finally took my seat, I noticed how Richard watched me, not openly, but carefully, as if he was trying to read something that no longer presented itself in familiar ways. Daniel cleared his throat once, then again, but said nothing, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Claire adjusted her napkin with deliberate attention, avoiding direct contact with either of us. It was Richard who broke the silence, his voice measured, almost casual, but with an edge beneath it that had not been there before. "We should talk about arrangements," he said, not looking at me directly at first, but then forcing himself to meet my eyes, as if the act itself required effort. I set my fork down gently, aligning it with the edge of the plate, and nodded once. "If there is something specific you would like to discuss, you can say it," I replied, my tone even, offering no resistance, no invitation either, just a quiet shift that placed the responsibility back where it belonged. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw something I had not seen before, not confidence, not control, but uncertainty, thin but unmistakable. "The house," he said finally. "It is too much to manage. It would be better if things were simplified." The words were familiar, echoing the language I had read earlier that day, and hearing them spoken out loud, stripped of the legal structure that had once made them seem official, they sounded smaller, less certain, like something still searching for solid ground. I nodded again, slowly, as if considering his point with genuine thought. "Simplified how?" I asked, my voice steady, not challenging, but precise. Claire glanced at him quickly, a flicker of something passing between them, and Daniel shifted in his seat, his discomfort now more visible, his silence heavier than before. Richard straightened slightly, as if preparing to move forward with something he had already decided. "We have been looking into options," he said. "Restructuring ownership, making things easier for everyone involved." I held his gaze, not interrupting, not reacting, allowing him to continue, because the more he said, the more he revealed. "There are documents," he added, his tone tightening just enough to signal that this was the direction he intended to take. "We can review them together." I let a moment pass before responding, just long enough for the silence to settle again, for the weight of his words to fully exist in the room. Then I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That sounds reasonable," I said. Not agreement, not refusal, just enough to keep the conversation moving exactly where I needed it to go. Across the table, Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she had been waiting for resistance that never came, and Daniel exhaled quietly, though he did not look up. Richard studied me again, more directly this time, searching for something beneath the surface, something that would confirm that I had accepted the path he had laid out. But there was nothing for him to find. I picked up my fork again and continued eating, the motion simple, unremarkable, and in that simplicity, I could feel the balance shifting, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but steadily, with each second that passed without the reaction they expected. "We can go over everything tomorrow," he said after a moment, his voice settling into something that sounded almost certain again, though not entirely. I nodded once more. Tomorrow works, I replied, my tone unchanged. And as the conversation dissolved back into quiet, into the small sounds of a meal that no longer felt ordinary, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed they were guiding me toward a decision that had already been made. What they did not realize was that they had just given me exactly what I needed: time, structure, and a moment of their choosing that I could now redefine on my own terms. The next morning arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting for something to unfold, and I moved through it with the same quiet consistency I had maintained the day before, making coffee, setting a plate, allowing the routine to carry forward without interruption, because consistency has a way of lowering defenses, of making people believe that nothing has changed even when everything has. Richard was already dressed when I entered the kitchen, his posture more rigid than usual, his movements sharper, controlled in a way that suggested he had spent the night thinking through what was supposed to happen next, and Daniel sat at the table with his phone in his hand, not scrolling, just holding it, as if he needed something to anchor his attention. Claire stood near the counter, her expression composed, but there was a tension in the way she held her shoulders, a slight stiffness that had not been there before. "We can go over the documents now," Richard said, without greeting, without delay, his voice carrying a certainty that sounded practiced rather than natural. I poured my coffee slowly, letting the sound fill the space for just a moment before I turned to face him, my expression calm, my posture relaxed. "That is fine," I said, my tone even, offering no resistance, no urgency either. He nodded once and gestured toward the dining room, and we all moved there together, taking our places around the same table where everything had begun to shift. The folder he placed in front of me was identical in structure to the one I had seen in the garage, the same crisp paper, the same precise formatting, and I rested my hands lightly on either side of it without opening it immediately. Instead, I looked at him, meeting his eyes directly, holding that moment just long enough to let the silence settle. "You can walk me through it," I said. He seemed to relax slightly at that, as if my willingness to listen confirmed what he had been expecting, and he began to speak, outlining the changes in a steady, controlled voice, explaining how ownership would be adjusted, how responsibilities would be shifted, how everything would be simplified, repeating the same language I had already seen, the same structure, the same intent. I listened without interrupting, my attention focused, my expression unchanged, and when he finished, he slid the document slightly closer to me, placing a pen beside it with a small, deliberate movement. "It just needs your signature," he said. The room was quiet again, but it was not the same kind of quiet as before. This one was heavier, more expectant, filled with the weight of a moment they believed had already been decided. I let my gaze drop to the document, scanning the lines briefly, not because I needed to read them again, but because I wanted the movement to feel natural, unhurried, and then I reached for the pen, holding it lightly between my fingers. Claire's posture shifted slightly, her breath catching just enough to be noticeable, and Daniel leaned forward, his attention fixed, while Richard watched me with a focus that bordered on intensity. I paused for a moment, the pen hovering just above the paper, and then I set it back down gently on the table. "I have a question," I said, my voice calm, steady, cutting through the tension without raising in volume. Richard's expression tightened just slightly. "What is it?" he asked. I folded my hands in front of me, resting them on the table, my posture composed. "Why is my signature necessary if everything has already been decided?" I asked, not accusing, not confrontational, just precise. The question lingered in the air, simple on the surface, but heavier underneath, and for the first time, I saw the structure of his certainty shift. "It is just a formality," he said after a moment, his tone controlled, but not as steady as before. I nodded once, as if considering that, then allowed a small pause before speaking again. "Then it should not be a problem to wait," I said. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation. "Wait for what?" he asked. I held his gaze, my expression unchanged. "For me to review this with my attorney," I replied. The word hung there, quiet but unmistakable, and I saw it land, not just with him, but with Claire and Daniel as well, the shift immediate, subtle, but undeniable. "Attorney?" Claire repeated, her voice controlled, but edged with something sharper. I turned my head slightly toward her, acknowledging the question without changing my expression. Yes, I said simply. Richard leaned back in his chair, his posture adjusting, his confidence no longer as firm as it had been just moments ago. That is not necessary, he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. I gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not warm, not cold, just present. It is for me, I replied. Silence followed, but it was no longer the same silence they had relied on before. This one belonged to me. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a soft, controlled movement, leaving the document untouched on the table. We can continue this conversation after I have had it reviewed, I said, my tone final without needing to be forceful. No one stopped me. No one argued. And as I walked away from the table, I understood with complete clarity that the balance had shifted entirely. They had believed they were leading me to a conclusion that benefited them. Instead, they had revealed everything I needed to take control of my own outcome. And this time, I would decide exactly how it ended.